My name's Tony Greenstein. I've been a long-standing Jewish anti-Zionist. I was a co-founder of the National Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and obviously I'm active now against the campaigning against the genocide in Gaza. What more really is there to say?
It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about, not too long, but a bit about how you split with Palestine Solidarity that you had set up. I think quite a lot of people, activists, have come across this idea that you get an organisation going, you're there to get it a name for itself, and then somehow it kind of migrates into a different direction.
Yeah, well, yes, I did. I was a co-founder of PSC in 1982, just before the invasion of Lebanon, and I was a member for many years. But I first resigned in 1993 after it supported the Oslo Accords, which I saw as an absolute disaster for the Palestinians. That Israel was never ever going to concede a second state, a Palestinian state. The whole purpose of Zionism is to expel the Palestinians, not allow them self-determination. Then I did rejoin, and then in 2022 they adopted a new constitution which abandons opposition to Zionism. Now, Zionism is the guiding, ruling ideology of the Israeli state. It is the founding movement of that state, and to abandon opposition to it because the right wing equates Zionism with being Jewish, which of course they do, but quite falsely, I can no longer remain a member. The purpose of the Palestine Solidarity Movement is also to educate its own members, such as the fact that when Zionism as a political movement arose in the 19th century, late 19th century, most Jews opposed it. They saw it as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism, because the anti-Semites told Jews, get out, we don't want you. And the Zionists said, yes, we're quite happy to. That's not unusual in the separatist movement. Sometimes a section of the oppressed takes on the ideas of their oppressor and claims them as its own. But that's what Zionism was. It was a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. And today we see it playing out in Gaza, where they've adopted the ideology of racial supremacy, really of the Nazis. What's happening in Gaza is as horrific as what the Nazis did in occupied territories. Indeed, the attack on Al-Shifa hospital recently probably exceeds any Nazi attack in Poland. It is so horrific to be beyond comprehension.
Yeah. Last week, I interviewed a Canadian Muslim writer, David Livingston. He's just brought out a book called Zionism, A History of a Jewish Heresy. I know your father was a rabbi. You're not, but no. Is it fair to talk about it as a heresy? This is the sort of language that was used in medieval times.
I don't know whether I would call it a heresy because I'm not religious. So the term heresy and heretic is really a religious concept of someone who is really an apostate. But I think it's antithetical to all the Jewish traditions. When people used to think of Jews, they used to think of revolutionaries, socialists, people who were contrarian, and also people like Freud, Einstein, Spinoza, and so on. Some of the founders of the emancipation and that kind of rational thought. Today, the Jewish state, it's thought of as a military siege, supremacist state, So in that sense, it's completely contrary to the Jewish tradition, which came about as a result of the Jewish predicament, in a sense. Jews were like, as Hannah Arendt said, they were kind of the pariah in society. So, yes.
I know you've done a book about the Zionism and the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and you've made reference to the Nazis there. Now, this is seen as an absolute anathema in much of the Western world, Europe and the United States, to even think of contemplating a comparison between Zionism and Nazism. And yet in Israel itself, there's quite a lot of this goes on. So can you just take us through a little bit about the what you think justifies talking about it in these terms?
Well, for the first week, we have to understand that the period of Nazi rule from 1933 to 35 wasn't an aberration, although some of the things they did, they came out of existing thought and ideas. For instance, racial eugenics, the idea of cleansing the race, purifying the race, ensuring that there was selective breeding and applying that in social policy. I mean, Hitler attributed that, quite rightly, to what the American states were doing in applying eugenics, sterilizing forcibly women in order to ensure that there was a better, if you like, breed of American who was born, and to get rid of the enfeebled. The idea that mental illness was hereditary was very much part of that. The Nazis were supported when they came to power. Lloyd George, even Churchill supported them because they were seen as anti-communists. It was only gradually that the Nazis were seen for what they were. I mean, I've written a book on fascism in Brighton, fighting fascism, and the police, the Sussex or the Brighton police, had a delegation over from the German police in the mid-30s when they were part of the SS overall structure, the Reich Security main office. So, I mean, the idea that we've always been opposed and you can't compare anyone to the Nazis is just absurd. The Nazis were part and parcel of the existing political, social, economic system. And of course you can understand and make comparisons. Because if you don't make comparisons, you don't really understand the phenomena. They just become demons. And demons are really supernatural beings. So, yes, of course you can compare. And when, for example, in Nazi Germany in 1935, the Nuremberg laws, which were the racial classification laws to maintain the blood and purity of the Aryan race, they forbade Jews and non-Jews from having sexual intercourse or marrying each other. Then how is that different, as Hannah Arendt said in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, from the position in the Israeli state, where it's impossible for a non-Jew to marry a Jew? Because the only marriage that can take place is within the national racial classification. So Jews marry Jews, Arabs marry Arabs. If you want to marry a non-Jew in Israel, you have to go to Cyprus. You can't do it in Israel. And that's just one example. The whole racial classification. I mean, Arabs cannot access most of Israeli state land. Well, I mean, that's what was happening in Nazi Germany. So, yes, there are many comparisons. Well, when today Israelis have on their car bumper stickers, finish them off or exterminate now, is that different from the attitude of the Nazis to the Jews? On the contrary, we must compare and compare. Of course they don't like it, but they have to be reminded that when they're shooting and exterminating Palestinians in Gaza, that's exactly what the Nazis did to Jews. And if they don't like it, then that's tough. Stop doing it.
Bernard Shaw, as well, was one of these people who were into eugenics. But You know, there's a whole. There's something a bit more deeper and more troubling about this idea of having a master race. I mean, you can see why some maniacs might think, well, only the fittest shall survive. The weaklings, well, we'll just put them in the meat grinder or get rid of them some other way. That's one ideology. But I mean, there's something more going on here, isn't there? That it's not just the survival of the fittest. It's also a specific kind of genetic line of the fittest, even if they aren't necessarily the fittest, that must survive. That seems to be embodied both in the Nazi idea of the master race, the Aryans, and what's happening with the Zionists in the Middle East now.
Well, yes. I mean, Zionism, I mean, the ideologues who founded Zionism, people like Arthur Rupin, very definitely believed in the ideas of eugenics, the survival of the fittest, breeding, if you like, breeding out genetic deficiencies. I mean, not all of that, of course, is nonsense. There's no scientific backing or basis for that whatsoever. But the idea of the chosen race, and, you know, I mean, that was a religious concept, the chosen people, which originally was meant that you were chosen to serve others, but now it's been reinterpreted by Israel and by Zionist ideology as a master race concept. And Jewish racial purity is very, very important in Israel, and so Palestinians suffer accordingly. There's only one nationality really in Israel that counts, and that's the Jewish nationality. There's no Israeli nationality. As Netanyahu said, Israel is a state not of all its citizens, but its Jewish citizens. And that is the fundamental. So, yes, I mean, eugenics is part of this. And although eugenics is not popular now, the ideas that percolate and survive from it are current. And it's even within the Jewish people in Israel, you have those ideas as well, because when you have ideologies of elitism, then they also apply to the elite group itself. But yes, I mean, Zionism was the mirror image in many ways, but that's what my book is about. I mean, it is how the Zionist movement actually welcomed the Nazis to power, because they saw that the expulsion of Jews from Europe and from Germany in particular could only benefit the Zionist movement, whose main aim, whose sole aim was in the 1930s and the 1940s was to build the Jewish state. Saving Jews was not a priority in the slightest. And indeed, I gave many, many examples of where the Zionists obstructed the efforts of other Jews to rescue refugees because they weren't going to Palestine. Their belief was, and their logic was, well, if Jews can be saved and they don't go to Palestine, what's the purpose of a Jewish state? So they were vociferously hostile. And you saw that in America with the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe, led by someone who was a Zionist, but was a dissident Zionist, Peter Bergson, Shmuel Merlin, and backed up by Ben Hecht, a very famous theatre director and playwright. And they campaigned and campaigned to establish the War Refugee Board in January 1944. Roosevelt eventually set it up. The Zionists opposed that. They weren't interested. But it was established eventually above their heads, despite their efforts. And the War Refugee Board, which was established very late in the Holocaust, saved about 200,000 people. So the Zionist record is a miserable one in the Holocaust. But you don't read about it in books today, of course.
No, you don't. No. Why is that? Yeah.
Well, because the Holocaust has been adapted as an ideology to justify the existence of the Israeli state, and it has set up institutions and academies, and topped up by Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Propaganda Museum, as I call it, in Jerusalem. They take every visiting statesman to Israel to Yad Vashem to, emphasize that Israel inherits the memory of those who died. I mean, they've co-opted the memory of those they weren't concerned about at the time. And what I said, and what I've said, a demonstration recently in Glasgow, Israel claims to inherit the memory of those who died in the Holocaust, but in reality, it inherits the memory of those who killed the Jews who died. That's reality. Their attitude in Gaza, when they talk about human animals, you remember Yoav Gallant when he was laid down the basis of the Israeli operation. He described Palestinians as human animals. That's word for word what Himmler called the Jews in a famous speech in 1943, 4th of October 1943 in Posen, Poland, when he explained to senior SS officers why it was necessary to exterminate not just Jewish adults, but also the children, because they would come back as avengers for their parents. And he referred to them as human animals, and Hitler referred to them as human cattle. So, but this is how Israelis today speak. There's no conscious self-reflection that maybe that's how our enemies used to speak as well of us.
Yes, very concerning. I mean, just to bring things up to date a little bit, over Easter I went to church on Easter Sunday, and there was no mention in the sermon anything to do with Gaza, which I came up to the priest at the end of it, and I said, well, you could have mentioned Gaza, and a woman who stood next to him said, I support Israel. So you've got this kind of Christian Zionist thing going on too, which is there to sort of scare the clergy into not breaking the topic. So can you just say a little bit about the Christian Zionists? They're something, that again I would call a heresy, but anyway, what do you make of them?
Yeah, well, no, I agree. I mean, it's worse. It's a kind of fascist, imperialist ideology. The first Zionists were not Jewish. The first Zionists were Christians, and they acted as the kind of ideological outriders to British and Western imperialism, because that way you could justify establishing a settler colonial state, an armed fortress state, on the banks of the Suez Canal to protect British and Western interests. And that is as true today as it was 1.5 centuries ago. Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism. The Christians wanted us to return to atone, if you like, for our sin in rejecting Jesus Christ to begin with. So there is a theological interpretation to it. But this idea that Jews should return to Israel, well, it's part of this kind of messianic belief that once Jews do return, there'll be a battle of Armageddon, and then most people will, of course, be consumed in the fires, but the chosen few will rapture up to heaven. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. They believe this, but they use this to justify their efforts to support Israel. So she supports Israel, and that means she supports the genocide in Gaza. She supports killing children.
A lot of this has been based on this thing called the Schofield Reference Bible. But anyhow, look, look, I first spoke to you not long after the genocide in Gaza really kicked off. I think it was the middle of October 2023, Tony. I mean, what we've seen is just been relentless, unbelievable.
That is.
Now we're getting horrific. Towards starvation and deliberate starvation of people. I mean, it's been absolutely clear to anyone that's been paying attention that this really is a prison camp. It's not a place to live, and that the descriptions of October the 7th being a prison break look a little bit more sensible now for people who have seen it. There's also the role of the Egyptians in basically policing the border for the Israelis. But anyway, what do you make of it? We've got it's roughly 35,000, roughly anyway, innocent people have been killed by the Israeli Defense Force. And actually there's been some pretty good, I've seen some good sizable peace demonstrations, vigils and that sort of thing in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv too. So where are we at now after this, 6 months?
Well, it's hard to say. Firstly, 35,000 is an underestimate because there's up to 10,000 people buried in the rubble. It could be approaching 50,000. And then there's 120,000, probably more, who've been injured. So we're approaching 10% of the Gazan population. Now you tell me that's not a Holocaust. I mean, it just beggars belief. I mean, the atrocities that Israel is committing, I mean, mass executions, torture, installations. By their own admission, 27 prisoners, I think, have died whilst being in captivity. We know why. They've been tortured to death, basically. I mean, what Israel is doing is horrific beyond belief, and the West supports it. It's a genocide taking place before our very eyes, and yet, the leaders of our nations, Cameron, Biden, etc., are pumping arms to Israel so they can continue. I mean, words fail me.
Well, what do you make of the inactivity of the Arab countries? Because it does seem to have reaped even if it's taken lots and lots of people dying to reap some rewards, because the Americans have recently stopped using their veto at the UN Security Council and actually did vote for a ceasefire for the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Well, they didn't vote for it. They abstained.
That's right, abstained. Sorry, yeah.
But then the American ambassador to the UN said, well, this isn't a binding resolution. So they were signalling to the Israelis, continue as you've done before. So despite all the hand-wringing, we judge them by their actions, not by the words, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
And also, Biden's still now pushing an aid package to Israel through Congress. I mean, what he says is of no account.
Well, there has been certainly some pushback in the United States against the constant supply of arms to Israel. A little bit of pushback. But anyway, what do you make of the Iranian strike? This is the first time the Iranians have struck. They're a load of drones and actually some proper missiles, ballistic missiles that hit the Israeli air bases that struck the, where the aircraft took off to hit the Damascus consulate of Iran. Well,
to be quite honest, I think it was more theatre than reality. They telegraphed, they warned the Americans in advance exactly what they were doing. They telegraphed what they were doing. These drones were sent over. I mean, most of them were shot down, and they targeted bases, which is fair enough, but they haven't done a great deal, Iran. It's more, to be honest, theatre and gesture politics. I think the heroes of it are the Houthis, who stopped navigation in the Red Sea almost, and made the West pay a price. But the Arab regimes are just utterly corrupt, autocratic, repressive. Egypt's regime is the equivalent to Pinochet's Chile. It's a horrific police state. And any sign of manifestation of support for the Palestinians is quickly suppressed. These regimes hate their own people. They fear their own people. And it's only when the masses in the Arab street get it together to overthrow these regimes and take control of the oil wealth, which has been squandered by these corrupt plutocrats, that we will see the liberation of the Palestinians, I'm afraid.
Look, hang on, because don't you think that the Israelis are actually trying to draw these Arab countries into a fight? Because that will bring the Americans along? I mean, isn't it a bit unwise to take the bait?
Well, these regimes exist on top of their populations. They exist in fear of their populations. The populations are made clear in Jordan and other countries, Iraq and so on, what they think of what's happening in Gaza. They're massively opposed to it. But the regimes are sucked into the Western imperialist orbit. They are client regimes in every sense. So they actually turn to Israel for support. So when the Houthis block the Red Sea, the UAE has a land bridge through Jordan to Israel to bypass it. I mean, they're totally traitorous. They are regimes which should be removed. I mean, the Saudi regime, it's hardly a democratic regime, is it? I mean, it's based on fear and tyranny and mass executions. I mean, all these regimes need to go. They serve the Western interest, and that's why we had the Abraham Accords under Trump, which basically normalized, as they called it, relations between them and the Israeli state. Some of them have opened embassies, UAE, Bahrain, I think Abu Dhabi. They've opened embassies in Israel. So, in essence, the Arab regimes, which are protected by Israel, have come to terms openly with Israel. We always knew they had relations, but they were under the carpet, as it were. But today, they're open.
Yeah, we've seen in London and in other cities some massive demonstrations, the biggest since the 3 million for the Iraq war demonstration, around about 1.5 million, I think one of them was.
About 1 million, I think. About 1 million.
Yeah, this is a terrific response from the Londoners. Absolutely. And people coming in. But what about the trade union movement?
Well, it has not been so good. Some unions have been better than others, but my own union, Unite, under Sharon Graham, has been absolutely abysmal. Sharon Graham is in the Zionist pocket. She's done absolutely nothing, and she's done her best to squash solidarity, to prevent solidarity. As far as I go, she's a Zionist cuckoo in the nest. She refuses to implement Palestine policy that Unite has democratically passed. And she is hostile. The Zionists welcomed her election. They obviously knew more than we did. As far as I'm concerned, she's an enemy. I have no time for her at all. And I've only just come back from a Unite for Palestine meeting tonight, where we're trying to get it together to oppose what she's doing. She's extremely right-wing.
Now, I'm going to be sharing your article this week on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, Tony. But you've also talked about the censorship of documentaries that Unite have been doing. Can you tell us about some of those?
Yeah. Well, the first one was the film. It was brought out in June last year, Jeremy Corbyn, The Big Lie. And it was produced by Platform Films, an independent production company, which works mainly for trade unions, including Unite and the TNG in the past. And they produced this film showing how anti-Semitism had been weaponized in the Labour Party in order to target supporters of the Palestinians, and how it had been used in particular against Jewish supporters of the Palestinians, thus demonstrating that it wasn't anything to do with anti-Semitism, it was to do with Zionism. Graham banned it from being shown at any Unite premises on a whole series of lies we were given. We didn't have the resources and this, and it wasn't a priority. But eventually they came clean. They didn't want to offend the Zionists. And the Zionists openly welcomed it. The campaign against anti-Semitism gave her a pat on the back for her efforts. But then recently, in the last couple of days, an anti-fascist and anti-racist film, which has been produced, showing how the ideology of racism and fascism have been manipulated and the role of music in combating it, that's been banned. It's quite amazing. I mean, I'm just wondering how far to the right she's going to travel. We have a dictatorship now in Unite. And what you do with dictators is you have to overthrow them.
I mean, is that feasible? Are there candidates? Is there a proper democratic process?
No, I mean, Unite is incredibly undemocratic. This is one of the problems of the legacy of Len McCluskey, who, although he was good in very many ways, he presided over an undemocratic structure where regional secretaries and barons ruled the roost, and where the general secretary had a lot of power. And although he may have used it to the good, Sharon Graham is using it to the bad. And that is the problem we face. That it's very difficult to hold them to account. The executive only meets every 3 months. It has no power. So the question is what we do. It's going to be a long campaign, which is aimed really at making sure she's a one-term general secretary. She has to go. I mean, she's openly come out in support of NATO and or the AUKUS Pact, the United States attempt to cobble together an alliance to attack China in the Pacific. I mean, she thinks that the only concern of Unite is the jobs of workers in the arms industry.
Well, I mean, I know Unite used to be, I think I'm right in saying, was NUPE, am I right?
No, that was Unison.
Oh, that's Unison.
Right. NUPE joined with two other unions, COSI and one other, to form Unison way back in the 1990s. But no, Unite came from Amicus and the Transport and General Workers Union, and Amicus was itself a merger of the Engineering Union and various others. I can't remember the exact.
But how has it migrated from becoming something like the Transport and General to what is largely a lot of public employees in there?
Absolutely, yes. Well, Sharon Graham she was elected as a non-political, but she wasn't. She was extremely right-wing, and she is now saying that really arms workers, the job of arms workers are all that matters. Although every job is capital intensive, it takes away resources from the public sector, which provides far more jobs in the national health, social care, local government, and so on. And we're seeing this in Britain, that as money gets transferred from the NHS to so-called defence, it's going to create unemployment in its wake. And also, of course, the NHS is now struggling and is going to continue to struggle. Starmer has said he's going to increase the defence budget by 25%. You know, he hasn't said that for the National Health Service or anything else. So we see a collapse of public services in this country side by side with our fealty to NATO.
Just turning back to Gaza, do you see a feasible peace developing? We've had Craig Murray last week coming out and saying he thinks that the Russians and the Chinese should put together some sort of UN peacekeeping force and actually get into Gaza to defend the Palestinians.
I would like to think so, but I don't think either Russia or China would do so, because that would mean confrontation with the United States. The United Nations is, at the end of the day, a toothless tiger unless the US backs it up and it becomes a kind of cover, a figure for US interests. Unfortunately not. It is up to the Palestinians. I mean, the only good thing to say to come out of it is that Israel on the ground, its ground operation, has been a failure. Hamas have extracted large casualties, which the Israelis are not even admitting, but there's lots of videos going round about the ambushes and so on. They were driven out of Khan Yunis last week. They suffered heavy casualties there. So Hamas and the other liberation resistance movements have been, if you like, combating Israel successfully. Of course, they don't have an air force, so Israel can bomb everything to smithereens. That's the problem. And Israel's been doing that. It's been laying it to waste. So I can't see a force which is going to stop Israel until we redouble and triple our efforts to bring our own government to account. That's the tragedy of it. I'm afraid.
What's your blog if people are interested in following you, what you do, your social media?
Just Google Tony Greenstein's blog. I have one at Blogspot, and I have another which is on my own website. So if you just Google my blog, you'll be able to read my latest article on Sharon Graham and much more. Okay?
Thanks very much, Tony. Tony Greenstein, thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.